Back in 1986, when I was a state archaeologist, I was called on to recover the skeletal remains of a man whose unmarked grave had started to erode out of the cliff face at Mendocino Headland State Park in the town of Mendocino in Northern California. For the lack of a proper name, I called him the Mendocino Man. During the previous year, the popular TV series, Murder, She Wrote, had been permitted to film an episode just 100 feet away from the Mendocino Man's resting place. In the TV show, the skeleton of a murder victim from long ago is discovered on a coastal construction site in fictitious Cabot Cove, Maine. Of course, amateur crime sleuth Jessica Fletcher, played by Angela Lansbury, is called in and she manages to solve this very cold case involving one Joshua Peabody, the founder of Cabot Cove and a Revolutionary War hero to boot. When the Mendocino Man was discovered just a few months later, it caused quite a stir in the area and was widely reported by the local news media. Unfortunately, Jessica Fletcher wasn't available to investigate, so I was sent instead. I carefully recovered what remained of the Mendocino Man. My initial analysis of the remains indicated that he had been quite tall and robust, and that he had drowned in the sea circa 1860. The man was found to be missing the bones of his hands and feet, and the skull was missing as well. A handful of dark beach sand was found beside each of the thighs, suggestive of death by drowning. I assumed that the sand had filled the man's pants pockets as he washed about in the surf. He had been buried in a simple redwood coffin, of which only a few small bits and pieces remained. The grave was aligned east to west, with the man's head pointing to the sea. The remains were taken to Sacramento for a second opinion prior to their reburial. I had promised to return to Mendocino Man to the people of Mendocino within a couple of months of the recovery, and I had hoped to bury the remains in the town cemetery or otherwise on the coastal bluff near where they had been found. Unfortunately, it would be 27 years before I could make good on my promise. The Mendocino Man's remains arrived in Sacramento at about the same time California State Parks initiated a comprehensive and necessary assessment of all the skeletal remains in its possession, a program designed to satisfy the needs of Native American repatriation. Although the Mendocino Man was not believed to be of Native American ancestry, his remains were redirected as part of the study. Many years went by. Finally, in 2011, I inquired about the man's status, and to my surprise, discovered that the remains could now be returned to the community for reburial. Emily Carlton, an archaeologist who was then employed by the California State Parks in Sacramento, was tasked to conduct a final osteological analysis of the man's remains in order to determine what else could be learned from them. Carlton studied the bones in 2012 and determined that they came from a male of Northern European ancestry, 20 to 27 years of age, who stood around 6 feet tall. The man had strong muscle attachments in his arms and back, leading to the conclusion that he was likely a sailor or perhaps a logger who had gone to sea. Carlton had an expert look at the milk glass and brass buttons that I had found with the remains in 1986. My circa 1860 date was confirmed by the expert, who noted that the man had been wearing a shirt and trousers when he was buried. Small pieces of fabric had been preserved by the buttons. The evidence suggested that the Mendocino Man was found by the townspeople after washing up on the beach, his trouser pockets filled with beach sand, and missing his hands and feet. It is unclear if his head was lost in the sea circa 1860, as the hands and feet had been, or if the skull was lost to coastal erosion in 1986. With the head facing the sea, the skull would have been the first skeletal element to wash out of the grave. Upon the discovery of the drowning victim, a hastily made redwood coffin was probably taken down to the beach. The young man placed within it, the coffin nailed shut, and then taken up to the coastal terrace above for immediate burial. According to the Daily Alta California of November 22, 1860, 12 sailors were drowned in Mendocino Bay on November 15, 1860. The brig, J.S. Cabot, while trying to enter the bay during a fierce storm, struck a rock and capsized. 7 sailors aboard the Cabot were lost, as were 5 men from the schooner Kaluna, who had rowed out from shore in a failed attempt to rescue the drowning men. It is conceivable that the Mendocino Man was one of those lost in this tragedy. Upon concluding her analysis, Carleton, at my request, looked into the possibility of burying the Mendocino Man in the town cemetery. Carleton contacted the Mendocino Historical Society, who put her in contact with Lori Hill, the manager of the Mendocino Little River Cemetery District. Hill was extremely enthusiastic, and with the support of her board of directors, provided at no cost a grave plot in the town's historic Evergreen Cemetery. She also commissioned a local stonemason and sculptor, Robert Milholland, to carve a headstone for the Mendocino Man's grave. Milholland chose a slab of fine Italian marble, on which he carved these words, "Unknown, a casualty of the sea," circa 1860. Additionally, Milholland carved a wave and star on the headstone to commemorate the likelihood that the Mendocino Man had been a sailor. On April 23, 2013, a reburial ceremony was held at Evergreen Cemetery at the edge of town. About 40 people participated. I served as the burial ceremony's officiate. The remains were interred in a small wooden coffin constructed by Chris Carleton, Emily Carleton's father. And a local Scottish bagpiper, Peter Capp, performed at certain intervals. At the conclusion of the ceremony, I read the poem Requiem by Robert Louis Stevenson. Upon its conclusion, and at my request, Capp began to play Amazing Grace and then slowly departed the cemetery on foot, with the sound of his bagpipes drifting away as he disappeared from view. It had taken almost 3 decades for California State Parks to return the Mendocino Man to his community, but the promise to do so was never forgotten. In the end, the honor that was shown this man as he was finally laid to rest was a fitting end to his long journey. Requiem by Robert Louis Stevenson. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter, home from the hill.